Hey everyone, and thank you all for joining my talk. So I am Maria, and I am a population ecologist who currently works at the Doñana Biological Station in southern Spain. And I want to talk to you a little bit about my most recent experience foraying from population towards community ecology, where I tried to develop more dynamic forecasts of changes and abundances of several interacting species in the community by assessing feedbacks within demography and species interactions. So I did this study using abundance data sets, which is typically collected in community ecological studies. And I tried to infer demography and species interactions from these abundance data sets. And thereby trying to answer whether this way we can get more robust forecasts and more biologically realistic forecasts of how communities will develop or will resist or recover from environmental change in the Mediterranean. So I did this work in Doñana National Park, which is located here in southern Spain, and which is one of the most important biodiversity hotspots in Europe. And in my case, I used data on shrub communities, so on different up to 11 shrub species that experienced a strong drought in 2005, and that were monitored ever since by a group of researchers. And these researchers essentially monitored cover and abundance of different species and linked these variables to the various measures of resilience, but have not really considered demographic mechanisms behind all of this. So I took on this data as well as their expert opinion and their expertise in these types of communities and what's going on there. And I used the Bayesian latent state variable approach, which I adapted from this wonderful paper, and also based on my own experience with mixture modeling. So I developed this Bayesian latent state variable approach to infer stage-specific survival and reproduction from the abundances of different size classes that we have. And you can see here the schematic overview of this demographic model, where I just sort of exploded abundances of sizes into mechanistic processes related to demographic transitions. So I did this for 5 most common interacting species at the study sites. And having the demography part covered, the way I incorporated species interactions is essentially after one annual step of this demographic model, we obtained abundances for each shrub species. And then for any given shrub species, here I'm using the example of this one, of Aluminium comitatum, I obtained the abundances of adults of neighboring shrubs and used these summed abundances as a covariate in the demographic rate models for all of these, for any given of these 5 interacting species. And this way I was able to incorporate both demography and species interactions dynamically and forecast these. And as an environmental or climatic covariate, I used winter rainfall, which is projected to decrease substantially in the near future. So if you look at the results of the demographic models that I get, here's an example of the lavender. You can see that we get quite nice results, really, and that both adult survival and sapling survival are negatively affected by interspecific density as expected. And in the case of sapling survival, also negatively affected by interspecific density. And these results are similar across other species. These models appear to be working, and they were quite nice, but we did face some challenges when developing them. And the key challenges were that you need a lot of data to parameterize these models. And you often need to rely not just on the empirical data collected at the site, but also on data integration from various sources. Because of these data requirements, you risk over parameterizing the models, and we also may complicate the interpretation, especially of the interactions among the shrubs, because when we had positive interaction effects, so positive effect of interspecific density, we could not infer whether it was because of facilitation or because of a missed environmental variable, right? The only inference we could do was based on expert knowledge. And on the other hand, simple abundance-based models, they lack biological mechanisms, but can kind of make it up a bit because they can include more model covariates. So the abundance models can per se be more complex because you save the degrees of freedom by being able to incorporating more environmental covariates and not having to deal with the demography part. Nevertheless, these types of dynamic models where you project demography and biotic interactions really pay off in the systems when we do forecasts. And we did forecasts over 50 years, assuming past winter rainfall or assuming decreases in winter rainfall as projected by IPCC climate change scenarios. And we did this forecast developing models that were either fully mechanistic, as in gray, that were mechanistic in terms of having demography, but they did not incorporate interspecific interactions, or simple models here in red that were just abundance-based, right? So projecting changes in abundances without looking at the demography. And here's the sort of results of one metric, which is mean abundance across the years for the 5 different species. And without going into minuscule detail, you can see already by the difference, the variation in the box plots, that our interpretation of the dynamics of this community depend quite strongly on what modeling type we are looking at. And these types of most mechanistic models usually explain our observations in the field much better than the simplest models based on abundance. And this is, for instance, the case for this one particular species, Cistus legonotis, where the mechanistic model projects increases under climate change. And this is something we also see in the field. But abundance-based models project decreases of the species, and they do so because they overestimate abundances of other shrub species, right? And this then confers more negative effects of interspecific density on C. legonotis, and therefore decreases abundance of this particular species, which we do not observe in the field. So to conclude, these multi-species demographic feedback models can make a big difference in interpretation of community dynamics under environmental change. They are very costly to build, though, and require a lot of expertise, which once again sort of just highlights the fact that we need a better integration among various disciplines of researchers to be able to do more robust forecasts. But mechanistic forecasts do pay off, and I would encourage researchers to explore these types of forecasts further. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators and all the volunteers, the wonderful volunteers who helped us with data collections. And I thank you all for listening.